Paul Lineman hadn't signed up for this war. Though the same couldn't be said for his old friend Marcus Walsh, who was now bellowing orders from down the line. Walsh had joined the 23rd Human Expeditionary Force a year before the conscription notices went out, claiming he saw which way the wind was blowing. Now here they both were, knee-deep in the rusty mud of Rosho-3. Incoming, Paul dropped into the muck as plasma fire screamed overhead, sizzling as it struck the trench wall behind him. The Dominion's latest push had been going for 6 hours now. 6 hours of non-stop attacks while their Rakiri allies held the safer rear positions. "I could be fixing comms units right now," he muttered, checking his rifle's charge. But no, had to get drafted into someone else's war. "Still complaining about missing your shop, Paul?" Walsh called out, a grin visible despite the mud caking his face. "Should have enlisted when I did. Could have been giving orders instead of taking them." Yeah, rub it in, oh mighty Sergeant Walsh," Paul shot back. Their friendly rivalry had only intensified since basic training, where Walsh had taken great pleasure in being able to mentor his childhood friend. A massive shape loomed over their trench, one of the Rakiri liaison officers. Major Trell, his fur meticulously groomed despite the battlefield conditions, looked down at them with barely concealed disdain. "Your unit will advance to Point Delta 7, he announced, not bothering to climb down to their level. "Our scouts report the enemy is massing artillery there. You will prevent this." Walsh stood, mud dripping from his armor. "Be nice if we had some of your scout data to work with, sir," he said, managing to make "sir" sound almost like an insult. Paul had to hide a smile. Walsh had always been better at working the system, even back when they were running their school's underground snack trade. Trell's ears flicked back in irritation. "The Rakiri 45th will take your position here. You have your orders, Sergeant. The human's talent for aggressive tactics makes you ideal for this mission." Paul's grip tightened on his rifle. They all knew what that meant. The Rakiri thought humans were too stupid to properly feel fear, too primitive to understand sophisticated tactics, so they got sent on the suicide missions, while the Rakiri handled the complex operations. "What about support?" Walsh asked, his voice carrying that dangerous pleasantness that Paul recognized from their youth. It was the same tone he'd used right before starting a fight with bullies twice his size. "The 45th will provide covering fire from this position." Trell's whiskers twitched in what passed for a smile. "Unless you feel your unit isn't capable of a simple frontal assault?" "Oh, we'll get it done," Walsh replied. "Just like humans always do, right, lineman?" "Right," Paul answered, falling into their old rhythm, "because we're too primitive to know when something's impossible." Trell turned and walked away, managing somehow to keep his feet clean despite the omnipresent mud. Paul checked his ammunition as Walsh moved down the line, preparing the unit for the attack. Next to him, Private Oster was doing the same, his young face set in grim lines. "You know what really gets me?" Oster muttered. "My sister's dating a Rakiri back on Embassy Station. Says they're misunderstood." He chambered around with unnecessary force. "Love to see her misunderstood buddies take point for once." "Save it," Paul replied, though he agreed. "Focus on surviving. I've got a shop to get back to. Plus, I can't let Walsh hold rank over me forever." Walsh reached their position. "Check your seals. We move in 5. And Paul?" He grinned that same reckless grin they'd shared as kids, plotting mischief. "Try to keep up this time." Paul nodded, running through his equipment check. He thought about his family's shop on Embassy Station, the neat rows of communication units, the smell of solder and electronics, his mother's patient hands showing him how to trace a circuit. All of it feeling very far from this mud-soaked hellhole. The order came down the line, "Ready up." Paul took his position, trying not to think about how exposed they'd be, crossing no man's land, trying not to think about the Rakiri watching from their safe positions, trying not to think about anything except the next step, the next breath, the next shot. "Hey, Paul," Walsh called out. "Bet I'd drop more Dominion than you." "In your dreams," Paul answered automatically, their childhood competition giving him something to focus on besides fear. Loser buys drinks when we get back to Embassy Station. Deal." The whistle blew. They went over the top. Behind them, the Rakiri watched as the human units charged into the teeth of the Dominion's defenses. Some of them even bothered to provide the promised covering fire. Paul Linneman ran and cursed and fought and lived. For now. He wasn't a soldier by choice, but by God, he'd show these furballs what a primitive human could do, and maybe, just maybe, he'd finally one-up Marcus Walsh in the process. The first 50 meters were always the worst. Paul had learned that the hard way over the past 3 months. 50 meters of pure exposure before you could even think about finding cover. He ran in a crouch, boots slipping in the rusty mud as plasma fire lit up the toxic air around him. "Spread out," Walsh's voice carried over the chaos. "Don't bunch up. Oster, stick with linemen." Paul felt rather than saw Oster fall in beside him. The kid was green but quick on his feet. Together they dove behind the remains of what had once been some kind of industrial crawler, now just another piece of twisted metal in the wasteland of no man's land. "3 tangos, 11 o'clock, Oster called out, his voice cracking with adrenaline. Paul spotted them, Dominion troops in their characteristic bone-white armor, trying to set up a heavy weapon. He squeezed off 3 shots, the rifle's kickback familiar against his shoulder. One went down, the second spun away wounded, the third... "Got him!" Oster yelled, his shot catching the last Dominion soldier clean in the chest. "Nice shooting," Paul grunted. "Walsh is going to dock me a point for that assist." A massive explosion lit up the battlefield to their right. Paul's heart sank as he saw 3 human soldiers disappear in the blast. The promised covering fire from the Rakiri 45th was spotty at best, leaving entire sections of the advance exposed. "Moving up," Walsh's voice crackled through the comm. "Second squad, provide covering fire. First squad with me." Paul and Oster were first squad. They burst from cover, charging toward the next piece of relative safety, a crater that looked fresh enough to trust its edges. More plasma fire cut through the air around them, close enough that Paul could smell the ozone. They almost made it. The shot caught Oster in the leg, spinning him face first into the mud. Paul grabbed his collar without thinking, dragging him the last few meters to the crater's edge. They tumbled in together as another barrage lit up their previous position. "Thanks," Oster gasped, fumbling for his medkit. "Guess I owe you one. You got the last Dominion back there. We're even." Paul helped him apply the sealing foam to his wound. "Can you still shoot?" "Yeah. Hurts like hell, but I can shoot." "Good, because we've got company." A wave of Dominion troops was advancing through their own trenches, trying to flank the human assault. Paul counted at least 20 of them, moving with the precision that made them such a feared fighting force. "Walsh," Paul called into his comm, "heavy contact on the right flank. We need that Rakiri support fire now." "Working on it," Walsh sounded out of breath. "They're saying they don't have clear lines of sight." "Bullshit, they've got the high ground." "Yeah, well, tell that to Major Trell. Hold what you can, we're almost to the artillery position." Paul swore and peeked over the crater's edge. The Dominion troops were getting closer, using their superior numbers to lay down devastating covering fire. Next to him, Oster was doing his best to return fire despite his injury. "Remember what you said about your sister's Rakiri boyfriend?" Paul asked as he reloaded. "Yeah. Starting to think she needs better taste in men." That got a laugh. Cut short by another explosion too close for comfort. Paul's trained eye could see the situation deteriorating rapidly. Without proper support, the human units were going to be caught in a classic hammer and anvil maneuver. Unless... "Oster, give me your demo charge." "Sir?" "The demo charge, and I'm not an officer, kid." Oster handed over the compact explosive device. Every human soldier carried one, a little going-away present if the Dominion ever tried to take them alive. Paul quickly programmed the detonator. "What are you thinking?" Oster asked, taking another shot at the advancing troops. "Something stupid." Paul checked the charge one last time. "Cover me." Before Oster could protest, Paul burst from the crater. He ran straight toward the Dominion advance, zigzagging as plasma fire tracked him. 20 meters. 10. 5. He hurled the charge with all his strength into a collapsed section of their old trench line, right where the Dominion troops were bunching up for their push. The explosion wasn't particularly large, but it didn't need to be. The ground, already unstable from countless artillery strikes, collapsed. Almost a dozen Dominion soldiers disappeared as their position became their grave. Paul was already running back when his comm crackled to life. "Damn it, lineman!" Walsh's voice held equal parts fury and amusement. "That's at least 5 kills. You're not winning our bet that easily." "Then you better step it up, Sergeant." Paul dove back into the crater beside Oster. "Because I'm just getting started." The remaining Dominion troops had fallen back to regroup, giving the human advance precious minutes to secure their positions. In the distance, Paul could see Walsh's team closing in on the artillery site, and far behind them, safe in their reinforced positions, the Rakiri 45th watched the primitive humans do what they did best. The impossible. "You know what the worst part is?" Oster asked as they prepared to move up again. "What's that?" "When this is over, they'll probably say we just got lucky." Paul checked his rifle's charge and smiled grimly. "Then I guess we'll just have to get lucky again, and again, and again, until they run out of excuses." They moved out, 2 primitive humans advancing through hell itself. The night was still young on Rosho-3, and there was more impossible yet to do. "They're coming again!" Paul barely heard Osha's warning over the sound of explosions. The Dominion's counterattack had been going for 2 hours now, wave after wave of troops trying to retake the artillery position. His rifle was running hot, the barrel glowing faintly in the perpetual twilight of Rosho-3. "Walsh!" he shouted into his comm. "Please tell me you found something good in that command center." "Oh, I found something all right," Walsh's voice crackled back, "but you're not going to like it. I already don't like anything about this situation." "Fair point. Get back here. You need to see this." Paul glanced at Oster, who was still favoring his wounded leg. "Can you cover the west approach?" "Yeah, go. I've got some new friends to help anyway." Oster gestured to 3 other human soldiers who had joined their position, all that remained of 3rd Squad. Paul moved carefully through their captured position. The Dominion artillery site turned out to be more than just big guns. It was a full forward command center, built into the natural rock formations of Rosho-3. The surviving members of 1st Squad had turned it into a makeshift fortress, using the Dominion's own defenses against them. He found Walsh in what had been the command and control room, surrounded by holographic displays showing tactical data. His friend's armor was scored and burned in several places, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "Remember how we always used to say the Rakiri were holding out on us?" Walsh asked without looking up. "Turns out we were right." Paul looked at the displays. At first, the tactical data meant nothing to him, just strings of numbers and position markers. Then he saw it, the pattern. "Son of a bitch," he breathed. "This isn't just a counterattack. This is their main offensive." Walsh nodded grimly. "The Dominion's been feeding bad intel to the Rakiri for weeks, making them think the big push would come through Sector 7. But this?" He gestured at the displays. "This is their real plan. They're going to punch right through here, roll up our entire flank. The Rakiri defenses in Sector 7 are a giant trap. They've committed almost 60% of their forces to defend against an attack that's never coming. We need to warn them. Already tried. The Rakiri command doesn't believe our intel, says their own intelligence is superior and beyond human understanding." Walsh's voice dripped with bitter amusement. "They think we're trying to get them to redirect forces here just to protect our own position." Another explosion rocked the complex. Paul grabbed a console to keep his balance. "How many troops are the Dominion committing to this attack?" "At least 3 divisions, maybe more. They know this is their chance to break the entire line." Walsh finally looked up, and Paul saw his own exhaustion mirrored in his friend's eyes. "We've got maybe 40 combat official personnel left, no heavy weapons since they took out our support platoon, and no reinforcements coming because our furry friends think we're crying wolf." Paul looked at the tactical displays again, his mind racing. Years of fixing complex communication systems had taught him to see patterns, to trace problems to their source. There had to be a solution. "The command center's communications array," he said suddenly. "Does it still work?" "Yeah, but what good does that do us? The Rakiri aren't listening." "Not them! The Dominion—" Walsh's eyes narrowed. "What are you thinking? Their forces are coordinating through encrypted channels, right? But they're still using this facility's protocols." Paul moved to one of the communications consoles, his fingers flying over the control. This, at least, felt familiar, like fixing a particularly complicated comm unit back in the shop. "You want to hack their comms?" Walsh asked. "They'll have redundancies, security. No time for that. But we don't need to hack them, we just need to make them think their own systems are compromised." Paul's hands kept moving as he spoke. "If we can't convince our allies that the attack is coming here, maybe we can convince the enemy that we know exactly where they're going to hit." Understanding dawned on Walsh's face. Create enough confusion in their command structure, and they'll have to delay their attack. Maybe even call it off entirely if they think their whole battle plan is exposed. Paul finished his modifications. "But we'll need to sell it. Make them think we've got a lot more forces here than we do." Walsh grinned, that same reckless grin from their school days. "Well then, let's give them a show they won't forget." The next hour was chaos. Paul used the command center's systems to broadcast fake tactical data on every frequency he could access, making it look like urgent but poorly encrypted human communications. References to phantom units, false deployment orders, coordinates of non-existent defense positions, all carefully crafted to suggest that the humans had uncovered the Dominion's true plan. Meanwhile, Walsh orchestrated their remaining troops in a masterful display of tactical deception. Units would fire from one position, then sprint through the tunnels to appear somewhere else entirely. Empty sections were rigged with time charges and automated weapons, creating the illusion of a much larger defending force. The Dominion attacks began to lose coherence. Their previously coordinated assaults became disjointed, tentative. Through intercepted communications, Paul could sense their command structure starting to fracture as uncertainty crept in. "They're buying it," he told Walsh during a brief lull. "Their local commanders are starting to question their orders. Some are even requesting confirmation of the entire battle plan." "Good," Walsh replied, reloading his rifle, "because we're almost out of tricks and ammo." Another explosion rattled the complex, closer this time. Paul looked at the tactical displays again, watching as the Dominion forces shifted and wavered. "Come on," he muttered. "Call it off. You're not sure anymore. Your perfect plan doesn't look so perfect now." The displays lit up with new data. Paul's heart leapt as he saw Dominion units beginning to fall back, their neat formations dissolving into defensive positions. "Walsh, they're withdrawing," Walsh finished, looking at the same data. "Holy shit, they're actually withdrawing." Paul sagged against the console, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "Think the Rakiri will believe us now?" "They'll probably say we got lucky again." Walsh clasped his shoulder. "Speaking of which, I count at least 12 confirmed kills for me today. How many did you get?" "Does making an entire Dominion offensive collapse count as one big kill?" "Hell no. I'm not letting you win on a technicality." They both laughed, the sound equal parts relief and lingering tension. Through the command center's viewport, Paul could see the sun finally rising over Rosho-3's horizon, painting the battlefield in shades of rust and gold. They had held, not through superior technology or sophisticated tactics, but through desperate innovation and stubborn refusal to die. Through doing what humans had always done, making the impossible possible, simply because no one had told them they couldn't. Somewhere out there, the Rakiri were about to discover that their primitive allies had just saved the entire front. Paul hoped they choked on that realization. But right now, he had more important concerns. "Hey, Walsh?" "Yeah, I really need a drink." The Rakiri delegation arrived shortly after noon. Paul watched them pick their way through the battlefield, their pristine uniforms a stark contrast to the mud and blood-stained human soldiers still securing the position. Major Trell was at the head of the group, his ears laid back in what Paul had learned to recognize as discomfort. Think they'll trip on their own pride? Oster muttered from his position nearby, his injured leg propped up on a piece of Dominion equipment. "Quiet," Walsh ordered, but there was no real force behind it. They were all watching the approaching officers with the same mixture of exhaustion and simmering resentment. The Rakiri reached their position, and Paul couldn't help but notice how they tried to avoid touching anything in the captured command center. Heaven forbid they get their fur dirty. "Sergeant Walsh," Trell began, his voice carefully neutral, "we've reviewed the tactical data you transmitted. It appears that your assessment of the situation was accurate." "You don't say," Walsh replied flatly. Another Rakiri officer stepped forward, a general, judging by his insignia. "The intelligence you gathered and your subsequent defense of this position prevented what could have been a catastrophic breach of our lines. The Dominion's main thrust would have caught our forces completely out of position." "Funny how that works," Paul found himself saying. "Almost like humans might actually know what we're talking about sometimes." The general's ears twitched. "Yes, well, the Rakiri High Command wishes to formally commend your unit for its actions. We'll be recommending commendations for—" "Keep them," Walsh interrupted. The assembled Rakiri officers bristled at the breach of protocol, but Walsh continued anyway. "We didn't hold this position for commendations. We held it because it needed to be held. Because that's what allies are supposed to do. And because we're too primitive to know when to give up," Oster added with a sharp grin. Trell's fur bristled. "Now see here?" "No, you see here," Paul stepped forward, surprising himself. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe he was just tired of staying quiet. "You want to give out medals? Fine, but what we really want is for you to understand something. We're not here because we enjoy dying for your war. Most of us didn't even choose to be here. I got drafted away from my family's shop on Embassy Station. Oster was studying engineering. But we're here, fighting and bleeding and watching our friends die." He gestured at the battlefield around them. "You look at humans and see primitives. See beings who don't understand your sophisticated tactics or advanced technology. But you know what I see? I see Rakiri officers who were so convinced of their own superiority that they nearly lost an entire sector because they couldn't imagine humans might actually know what they're talking about." The general's whiskers twitched. "Private lineman, is it? Your point is noted. Perhaps there has been some cultural misunderstanding between our forces." "Misunderstanding?" Walsh laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You sent us on what you thought was a suicide mission. Didn't even bother to provide the promised support fire. The only misunderstanding was you thinking we'd die quietly. And yet," Trell interjected, "despite these grievances, you still chose to warn us about the Dominion's true plans, even after we dismissed your initial warnings." "Yeah," Paul nodded. "Because that's what actual allies do. They look out for each other, even when the other side doesn't deserve it, even when they'd rather be anywhere else." The general was quiet for a moment, studying the assembled human soldiers with new eyes. Finally, he spoke. "The Rakiri 45th will be officially reprimanded for their failure to provide support. Major Trell will be reassigned, and I give you my personal word that future joint operations will be conducted with more mutual respect." "Respectfully, sir," Walsh replied. "We're not interested in promises of respect. Respect is earned, actions, not words." The general's ears perked up slightly, surprise, Paul had learned. "And how do you suggest we earn this respect, Sergeant?" "Next time we say there's a threat, listen. Next time we need support, provide it. Next time we tell you something's wrong, don't dismiss it just because we're human." Walsh's voice was level, professional, but carried an edge of steel. "We'll do the same for you, because that's what allies do. But we're done being your sacrificial pawns." The Rakiri officers exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Finally, the general nodded. "Very well. We will endeavor to prove ourselves worthy allies." He paused, then added, "For what it's worth, what you achieved here, it was impressive, even by Rakiri standards." "Funny," Paul replied. "By human standards, it was just another day of doing the impossible. Because nobody told us we couldn't." After the Rakiri left, Paul found himself standing with Walsh at the command center's viewport, watching the sun set over the battlefield. "Think anything will change?" he asked. Walsh shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not, but they'll think twice before underestimating us again." He grinned suddenly. "By the way, I counted. Final score? Me, 18, you 16. You're buying drinks when we get back to Embassy Station." Paul smiled despite his exhaustion. "Yeah, but I'd say making an entire Dominion offensive collapse should count for at least 3 kills." "Not a chance. Rules are rules." "Since when do you care about rules?" They both laughed, the sound echoing through the captured command center. Around them, human soldiers were already preparing for the next fight, the next impossible task, the next chance to prove that being primitive just meant finding solutions no one else would think of. The war wasn't over. The Dominion was still out there, and the Rakiri were still allies of convenience, more than true brothers in arms. But something had changed on Rosho-3. A point had been made, written in blood and mud and desperate courage. Never underestimate humans. They might just surprise you. And they never forget who their real friends are. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.